Well, kia ora everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Allan Freeth. He's had a really interesting background in the NGO world and the commercial world and lots of other things as well. For the last 3 years he's been Chief Executive of the Environmental Protection Authority, or EPA for short, and before that he was Chief Executive with Telstra Clear, and then Chief Executive and Managing Director with Wrightsons. So he's spanned a number of sectors as well. So Allan, you come to us with a wealth of experience. He's, in his spare time, he also is the chair and director of many NGOs and commercial organisations, including in the past chairing the Housing Corporation of New Zealand, so that would have been a challenging role. So Allan comes to us with a first-class degree in zoology and then a PhD in population genetics and an MBA with distinction, all of which I'm sure will help him with his EPA role, where he has to sort of make some really hard decisions about the environment using hard science, but also offset that with all the non-believers in science who think they know the answers. So Allan, we welcome you and look forward to hearing about the EPA.
Thank you. Well, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity. It's pertinent and special today. We've just had a very special farewell celebration, actually, of accomplishments of Kari Prendergast, who's finished as chair of the Environmental Protection Authority, and we've had Rex and Kari's daughter there. But what I thought I'd do is I'll show you a short video, very short video, which is really a testament to Kari and a testament of her contribution to the Environmental Protection Authority. We've lost the voiceover, so yeah, there's a voiceover, we've lost it, so we'll leave it, I think, for that. So I think technology has let us down, unfortunately, but you have some nice images, not the words.
Our economy and our people.
Yeah, it's a bit late.
Our job is to understand the intricacies of our environment while never losing sight of the bigger picture. Our job is to remain independent, to represent our people, and to work together with our communities. Our job is to safeguard our oceans, our greenery, our wildlife, our industries, our infrastructure, our culture, and our identity. And it's our job to find the right balance between these different priorities. We are scientists and specialists, policymakers and regulators, enablers and advisors, caretakers and history makers. We are the EPA, and we're working with Aotearoa, New Zealand.
So we lost some words at the start, I'm sorry about that, but it did talk about the role of the EPA in history and in future, and all the images you saw, images of areas that we have a role to play. That's not what I was going to talk about today, per se. What I'm going to talk about is science is a bit of a weird business. Some of you may believe science is always trying to prove something is true, whereas in experimental science, one works to prove a hypothesis false. That's what's called the null hypothesis. And its aim is to try and place some statistical boundary around what is true. Confused? Well, fair enough. The fact is, in science, you never say anything is true, categorically true. There's only one theory, at least in biological sciences, that has developed so much evidence in its favour that most scientists consider it to be a fact. I wonder if anyone knows what that theory is. Evolution. That's about the only one in science where we now accept that. But mostly we're hedging our bets. It's a scientific way, right? So I wanted to talk today, Veritas, nunquam, perit. The truth never perishes, it sometimes doesn't count. Running a scientific organisation in a disbelieving world. And certainly President Trump has given us many examples of where truth doesn't count. And I have to say over the past 3 years, I found myself in several situations where truth was a sideline to the story. Much of the work we do, and you'll see from the images, attracts controversy. And people claim they're arguing about science when they criticise the EPA when they're not. Some, such as Stephen Browning, go so far as to concoct a pseudo-scientific treatise to critique our science and assessments. And sadly, some academics, commentators and others get on his bandwagon, and they should know better. For ordinary man or woman, or as Diane Robertson, my communication manager, loves to say, the man or woman at the bus stop, it must be true if doctors or professors support such a view. At its heart, the scientific method is a disbelieving one. Scientists must collect and present evidence and undertake experiments in a strictly controlled manner and have this work peer reviewed. And once you pass those tests, you can then publish it so everyone can have a go. They can review it, critique, or more importantly, attempt to replicate the work. And it's that point at which science may indicate a causation, a correlation, a relationship, that we began looking at it and testing it. Our job at the EPA is to undertake detailed and comprehensive analysis of all the relevant evidence available about a chemical, a new organism, or a new technique, perhaps to mine the seabed, and to come to a conclusion about that evidence, balancing the risks with the benefits and costs in that particular instance. Risk is an essential concept to the work we undertake, and it's a difficult one to explain. In assessing risks, one considers the probability of an adverse event occurring, say introduced by a control agent we've just agreed to for samurai wasp to be released if stink bug, marinated stink bug appears in New Zealand. So if that goes feral, that would be an adverse event, and what would be the potential impact of such an event occurring. But it's also immensely personal. So I'm going to do a simple exercise just to illustrate. Think of your favourite pastime or sport. Maybe it's watching movies, perhaps it's golf, tennis, gardening or playing cards, and I see some familiar faces in the room, so I know about some of your activities and sports and interests. If the chances of you contracting a terminal disease by participating in this activity is 1 in a million, who would stop? Put your hand up. 1 in 100,000. 1 in 1,000? 1 in 100? 1 in 10? 2 in 10? The purpose of that exercise is to indicate we've got a variable appetite for risk. And we have one of our very talented young lawyers who's worked with Kari on a number of decisions, and his passion is mountain climbing without ropes. So he has an appetite at the extreme for risk, and in fact the geneticists amongst us would say he's carrying a number of genes that give him a predisposition for high-risk activities. My old PhD supervisor, Emeritus Professor John Gibson, used to say it's not a random sample of the population that walks down dark alleys. And he's right. People who do, who want to take shortcuts, have a different appetite for risk. But at the EPA, we have to calibrate risk in a systematic way. We can't do it in a personal way. So we have to apply our judgments reasonably, fairly, and on the basis of evidence, or perhaps cultural dimensions, such as Mata Rangamari. When evidence becomes scarce, conflicting or uncertain and the risk is too hard to quantify, our backstop is what's called the precautionary principle. Basically, if in doubt, don't do it. But for the vast majority of the decisions we make, there's enough science and evidence for us to make a decision. And sometimes that just doesn't count. So let's take something. Something just slips off the top of my head. 1080. Have you heard of 1080? We might not like the ideas of poison and the facts that they kill things, and the fact that they kill things. That's a valid point of view, and it's one that's deserving. I get it. I don't mind that. But it also happens that the things that 1080 kills are the things we don't like as well. Possums, stoats, rats. And why? Because they kill things we love, native trees and birds, but perhaps not as much as we love the former. 1080 as a chemical, for what it does, is about as safe as it gets. In Protecting Paradise, 1080 and the Fight to Save New Zealand's Wildlife, author Dave Hansford, if you haven't read his book, recounts that while I researched this book, I heard dozens of times that there's science on both sides. There's not. There's science on one side and there's belief in propaganda on the other. But the media have conflated the both, that there's an appearance of a debate. Doubt has been manufactured. And this is especially so, Dave says, on social media sites where you can still read that 1080 poisons water, affects the unborn, kills everything and causes cancer. We know from some social research that Doc's done in the last year or so that the more we try to explain science with science, the more the disbelievers disbelieve. And that's a natural trap for us at the EPA, because our work is science. So you tell me you think my science is rubbish, I'll provide more. You tell me you think that's rubbish, I'll just keep finding more, and I'll keep finding more overseas to prove or to give evidence to that. But that's not the issue, and it's not enough. And people are reacting to things that make them uneasy, that threaten and alarm them. And a week or so ago, my staff were listening to Talkback Radio. I've got to tell them to stop doing that. And it was about, guess what, glyphosate. The active ingredient in Roundup or other weed killers. Who uses glyphosate? Who stopped using glyphosate because of the controversy? Thank you. Good. But fair enough if you did. That would have been fine as well. And this has been in the news because there was a court ruling in California that found glyphosate was responsible for cancer contracted by a worker using Roundup. Putting aside the fact that this was the same legal system that gave us OJ's innocence, the news set off another round of anti-glyphosate outrage. And the caller said, no matter how many scientists you roll out, you just deeply know this stuff isn't good for you. No matter how many scientists you roll out, you just know this isn't good for us. What he's really saying, of course, apparently, is his deeply held belief trumps scientific research, that emotion overrides fact. And in a general sense, he may be right. Maybe it isn't good for us, all this chemicals and pesticides. But in the specific sense, the view of the EPA in New Zealand and other regulatory bodies around the world is that the risks of using this substance are acceptable, provided that specified controls, you have PPE, you wear gloves, you're careful where you spray it, are followed. And I won't even start on genetic modification GMOs. You would be here all afternoon. Suffice to say that the arguments about Frankenstein foods and the rest should not be dressed up in scientific terms. There's ample scope for arguments and debate on cultural and ethical grounds without dreaming up some pseudoscience to talk against it. There's a guy on BBC Radio too called Jeremy Vine. He runs Talkback and he's just published a book. And if you want an amusing afternoon, I'd recommend the book. He calculates that he's engaged with 25,000 callers during his 15 years on air. He has millions of listeners. But he really nails the issue. What's powerful is what's real. We long for that famously rare thing, authenticity. So on radio and elsewhere, politicians and bureaucrats, people like me, talk with calculation. We talk carefully and we talk in terms of risk and probability. Talkback call this talk with conviction. They may sound angry, sad, funny, but they sound real. And their experience resonates with the man at the bus stop, the woman at the bus stop, who says, yeah, I heard of so-and-so. Yeah, my friend down the road, they got cancer, and I'm sure he used glyphosate. And then it goes. And it does it in a way that official pronouncements just won't work. And Peter Gluckman, who was the previous chief scientist to the Prime Minister, rightly laid the blame at the feet of the scientists and their attitudes, or some of the blame, because he noted that the science community has worked in relative isolation, remaining comfortable in its own conviction that science provides the only rational basis for understanding the world around us and within us. And as the community scientists have assumed, singularly pushing more science is sufficient to reconcile differing worldviews than engaging in ways that might constructively shift the debate. And I think Peter's got a view, and the view is correct. And when I was growing up in Nelson, my mother used to dress us up to go and see the important man. It was always a man in those days, our family doctor. We had to dress up to go and see him because he was very important. And we had to behave. We were given a lecture before we got there, I remember that. And what he said was gospel, of course, because in those days there'd been no cervical cancer scandal, there was no Wikipedia, there was no Dr. Bob on TV or the radio. We just believed authority. Today's generations do not, and I say probably with due cause. But we cannot afford for science to be discarded or derided. It is at the heart of mankind's past, its present and its future. It cannot perish, it must count, together with the many other things that matter to society and communities. So we're taking these views to heart in the EPA. We want to engage in communities in new ways. We want to seek to listen and connect and build relationships that endure. And we want to discuss people's doubts, fears and level of understanding about 1080, weed killers and the host of other issues, and trying to explain our views. We've started a series of events and activities. You may see us at garden and home shows. Your grandchildren or children may tell you about our visits to school. And in fact, on Friday we were out in Pororoa with the Wellington rugby team, all 15 of them actually getting their face painted with safe chemical paints, and been instructed, kids were being instructed about what was dangerous chemicals, what wasn't dangerous chemicals, what they need to think about in their home. I'm in the process of appointing a real CEO, that is a community engagement advisor or officer, and that person who we're just interviewing at the moment will head out to schools on behalf of the EPA to talk to schools, to talk to universities, to talk to anyone who will listen. We're inviting stakeholders into the organisation. We're having what was called in the White House a big block of cheese day in the early days of the presidency. Anyone can come in and talk to us and talk to the experts, particularly those who don't agree with us. So today's one of these engagements, and I thank you. I'm happy to take questions. Your ethic of community service is an example to us. Thank you. We especially like your current efforts to plant 100,000 trees in Wellington's town belt. Given our role in carbon trading, we like to see the carbon taken up pretty quick, soaked up. That is, of course, if you believe in climate change, and I won't ask if anyone doesn't. Sometimes the truth may not seem to count, but it never perishes, and we at the EPA believe it's our responsibility to ensure the truth of today is preserved, to ensure the generations of tomorrow can enjoy the wonderful and beautiful place that we call Aotearoa. Thank you.
Questions? Yes, John.
Thank you. I wonder if you could discuss the mistrust that many people have in the commercial motive, in the sense that a lot of people are rather anti-business, particularly big business. When I say a lot of people, I mean a small number. And that if there's a commercial motive, therefore you're being exploited, and therefore science is not trusted in the sense of GMOs and so on. Is there a mistrust of commerce?
Oh, well, I think absolutely, but I remember my time at Wrightson, we were accused of running a conspiracy around Strong Wool, and this developed quite a lot of proportions with lawyers and others involved, and I used to reflect that we weren't competent enough to run Wrightson, let alone try to run a conspiracy within the whole industry. And I think that's the point, right? Most corporates, and I've worked in many large corporates, including Telstra, which was 80,000 people across Australia and the world, we're just holding the business together at times and trying to remain competent. But what people looking in see is the power of the corporate, the asymmetrical power, because at the end of the day, and Rob was talking about changing from telecom to voter, and I share his pain as well, because at the end of the day there's not a lot you can do if a corporate's there, and their sense, and when you read the amount of money they're making, you ascribe certain issues to them. And in my time at Telstra there, and certainly Wrightson, we were accused of all types of things. In the case of GMOs, particularly in this sphere, Monsanto hasn't done themselves any favours. They came out with a thing called the Terminator gene, which effectively prevented farmers from replanting their crops from their previous year crop, which by the way is illegal, but they were doing it. And the Terminator gene just killed the plant, so you didn't actually get any seed from it. That combined with Roundup resistance and genetic modification just provided the conspiracy. The whole thing just took off. We're